The trees and branches flew past me as I sprinted into the deep forest. I was puffing and panting as I was desperately trying to get away from the creature chasing me. I kept peering over my shoulder in intervals to make sure I was keeping a safe distance between myself and my pursuer. It was in the trees, crawling around the surfaces of the trunks and ascending into the greens like an insect. The leaves above me began to violently rustle as this thing was leaping between the trees. I picked up the pace and burst ahead. I saw a pair of headlamps in the distance and quickly made a beeline for them. Maybe they had a car or guns or both. I didn't care either way. I just didn't want to be alone anymore. I darted into the clearing and two hikers turned towards me. "Well, howdy there, my old friend. A little dark for a run, ain't it?" One of them chirped, causing the other to chuckle at his friend's remark. Out of breath, I began to gasp at them. "Please, you have to help me. There's something chasing me." My wheezy warning was cut short when a massive limbs snatched one of the hikers up in the blink of an eye and began to drag him up and around a large tree, like a squirrel who had just found a nut to gnaw on. Once the eight-legged creature had hauled his screaming and struggling victim out of eyesight into the shrub of the tree, an extremely violent exchange began as the sound of the hiker being torn apart, bone and cracking could be heard over the top of the hiker's piercing squeals of agony. I, along with the other hiker, looked up in horror as bits and pieces of what was his friend came flying out of the tree. And then after a few more seconds, the leaves and branches went still, and the screaming had stopped. We continued to stare upwards, waiting for something to happen or the creature to show itself again, when suddenly, something came hurtling towards the ground and struck it with a thud. Me and the other hiker took a couple of steps towards the heap of blood on the ground. The hiker had been snatched, looked like he had gone through a paper shredder. His neck was twisted around a full 360 degrees, and his facial expression was contorted into a wailing plea for mercy. It was truly haunting. But the worst thing was the red oozing from his mouth, or what was left of it at least. The man's teeth had all been ripped out, and judging by the holes in the man's gums, it was done with great force. Me and the other man looked on in horror, when suddenly we heard something scurrying up to us through the bushes. We waited anxiously for it to show itself, but nothing came. When suddenly the hiker next to me gently yelped and began to slowly whimper in fear. I turned to face him. A look of sharp horror was etched on to his pale white face, which had been drained of all color. The man said nothing, but his eyes begged me to help him. I began to examine the rest of him, looking for his source of terror, when I noticed an ominous figure began to emerge from behind him. Both of his legs and arms were being gripped by 4 pale claws. Just as my eyes had widened at my discovery, so did the man's. "Oh no," he muttered simply before he was violently torn into quarters in the blink of an eye. The 4 pieces of him struck the forest with a wet impact as they met the earth and the trees. Now revealing itself to me was the creature, a tall, gangly figure. It was a man, but it wasn't a man. Men don't have 8 legs, but the rest of it was human-ish anyway. It didn't have any clothes and its skin was a milky pale gray. I could see the blue of its veins run through its entire body. Its face looked like that of a human skull. It had skin but no muscle tissue underneath. The outlines of its orbital cheekbones protruded heavily through the outside layer of its flesh. Its eyes were almost all white, like it was blind. Its ears looked mutated and swollen, and given how they twitched every time I drew breath, I guessed that was its main sense. It stood upright, its bottom 4 limbs acting as a tetrapod. Its top 2 limbs were its main hands. Its claws and talons were much sharper and longer than its bottom counterparts. However, it was its remaining 2 limbs that were the most disturbing. They looked like clamps or pliers. I'm not sure how best to describe them, but they were covered in blood, wet and dried. When I had finished examining the creature, I looked it right in the face, and it flashed a toothy grin at me. Its teeth looked crooked and splintered. Some weren't even fully inserted into its gum, and they were dripping in blood. This thing began to giggle at me before saying, "New pair, you like 'em?" It cackled in a loud, insane manner, as its own sick, twisted humor. I shook my head in disgusted horror and took off running into the night. The creature screamed at me from a distance. "There's plenty more where these came from, James. All these baby and their sweet little milk teeth." Oh. Its demented laughter rang through the woods as I sprinted for my life. I was running so fast at first that I didn't even feel it on my face. I stopped and examined the cold, marbly pieces that were brushing against it. I looked in pure trepidation, as thousands and thousands of teeth were hanging from the branches all around me. If it wasn't so sinister, I would have said they looked quite beautiful, spinning and glistening in the moonlight. And then I heard the flies. I turned to the buzzing, and that's when I saw the pile, as tall as some of the trees. The sight of those victims caused me to shriek in terror. I snapped awake. I quickly scanned the room, looking for a confirmation that I was safe, which I was. I was in my cabin, my own cabin. This was the 4th nightmare in a row. Ever since Miles had told me about the other entities, they had begun to approach me in my dreams. I don't know if it was their doing or Keller manipulating his own image to get to me, but either way, I knew now, more than ever, that we needed to stop the black-robed people from giving these inhuman demons a path into our world. It began with the Whistler the first night. The following night, I saw the chameleon. He was dragging a group of innocent children into the woods. What happened to them once they were in the darkness, I was mercifully spared from knowing, but let me say, it took a lot of Phil's Irish coffee for me to get their screams out of my head the next day. The 3rd night, I was in the woods, when I heard my father calling my name. I followed his voice to find him standing in a clearing. There was something about his voice and tone, however, that just seemed a little bit off. But when he asked for me to come to him, telling me that he had missed me and how he wanted to give me a hug, I began to approach. As I got closer, I noticed that he was bleeding from every orifice on his body. Just as I was about to check him for injuries, another figure called my name from behind me and warned me to get away from the man. I turned to see another man standing on the edge of the tree line. This man had no skin. It had been completely removed. Every bone, organ, and tendon was on show and dripping with fresh claret. The figure begged me not to fall for the creature's lies, and I could tell from the tone and voice that this was my dad. I jumped back from the creature in front of me, which began to chuckle. I watched in disdain as a pair of antlers began to grow and burst through the skin on the figure's skull. Soon, the rest of the skin tore and burst open as the creature grew in size and muscle. A hulking humanoid with the appearance of a deer stood flashing a sickening grin at me and swiping a razor-sharp claw at my face. I woke up shortly after. I was visited by the flare that night. And now, I had just met the dentist. The only positive thing from this past 4 days was that the Ellen family seemed happy and content every day me and Phil rode up to check on them. But that one small pinch of optimism was just about to be ripped away. A knock on my cabin door snapped me out of my half-asleep daze. I looked at the time. 5:34 a.m. Jesus. "James, it's Phil," a voice said from the other side. "A bit early, Phil," I complained as I yawned, looking around for my belongings. "Just come on," he muttered. Yeah, just give me a second," I yelled, scrambling for my uniform and kit together. "Hurry up, James. We're needed." Phil's voice was full of despair. It made me take a minute to examine it. My heart sank. I finished getting ready and opened the door. Phil was propping his weary form up on the doorframe of the cabin with his 2 hands. I looked into his defeated eyes and matched his demeanor. "What happened, Phil?" I asked warily. Phil's hanging head raised up long enough to mutter, "The Ellens." We arrived at the site where the Ellens had set up their camp the previous night. There were no police as of yet other than Sheriff Farrar. A handful of hazard control reps were there, with Richard giving them orders. They were bagging up the blood-soaked belongings of the Ellens. The tent, which had been shredded open, was being dismantled and placed in a plastic bag. They were replacing it with a fresh tent and setting up a new campsite. I watched in horror as 2 bodies laid in the grass, both covered by a white sheet. Thick, wet red stains were still seeping through the fabric. Richard saw me and Phil and began to approach us. "Sorry for the early start, gentlemen, but we need help fixing this scene before the park opens and we report them missing. The story is that the Ellens asked you for some good hiking trails the previous day. We checked in this morning and found their campsite empty and undisturbed. People will assume that they got lost and perished in the forest," Richard explained. "Oh, just the usual then," I snapped. Richard eyed me with a bit of contempt, with a hint of understanding. "Look, James, I don't like this any more than you do, but we have to do it for the greater good. God, I'm so sick of hearing that," I vented. "We are all, kid," Phil said before adding, "and we're all sick of all the things we've got to burden in order to keep the outside world safe. But it's got to be done." He grabbed me by the back of my neck and raised his brow as he spoke, trying to get me to hold myself together. I held his gaze for a few short moments before sighing, nodding and letting it go. "What happened then?" Phil broke the ice, directing his question to Richard. "The couple had their skin removed. They had been beat up pretty bad with branches and logs too. Cause of death, best we could tell, was that they had their necks snapped like twigs. Kids nowhere to be seen. But before we relayed the dirt, there were drag marks leading them off into the trees. That's all we know," Richard informed. Just as we were all avoiding eye contact, shaking our heads at the violence bestowed upon this family, a car came racing up the trail and onto the grass. The passenger side door opened up and out climbed Miles. As he began to jog over to us, I could see behind him that the driver's side door had opened too. A man dressed in an official-looking uniform that matched Miles climbed out. He wore sunglasses so it was hard to see his face, but as he got close, there was a familiarity about him. It was winter and barely morning. The sunglasses certainly weren't to protect this man from UV rays. "Sit rep," Miles requested. I stood there, half thinking how rude of him not to acknowledge me or Phil, and half wondering how he knew what had happened. It was clear Richard was wondering too. As I was just saying to these guys, the adults were found right over there, and we found the bodies in the tent, stuffed into their sleeping bags. Kids missing. We're, fixing the scene as we speak," Richard reiterated. Miles turned to his colleague and gave him a strange look. He flicked his head towards the car and the man with the shades retreated back to the car. Right, James. Phil, you stay here and supervise the site while the scene is being fixed. Richard, I need you to spare me and my colleague a couple of your agents. We're going to survey the woods and make sure there's nothing that can be found by the public, he ordered. Richard pouted and nodded his head gently and made his way over to the hazard control team. Shouldn't we at least try to look for the kids? Maybe they got away, I asked naively. Miles half looked up from frantically texting someone on his phone. What? Oh, yeah, that's what I meant. We'll look for the kids, Miles sputtered. Well, me and Phil are trained as search and rescue operatives. You guys are trained in cover-up, so how about we go into the woods and you stay? My suggestion was shut down dismissively by Miles. Oh, no, I think it's best you stay here. Keep up appearances. Should any hikers pop up, a bunch of guys in suits will look suspicious, Miles countered, as he began waving over his colleague, hurrying him up. But the park's closed, and there are no visitors scheduled to be on the side of the park anyway. My response was met with silence as Miles completely disregarded it. Instead, he met his mystery friend by the tree line. The man was carrying some sort of tablet with him, which the two were now inspecting. Before Miles pointed into the trees, the man nodded at him in agreement and the two men ran in that direction. Something's off, Phil. I'm inclined to agree, Phil responded. It was a few minutes before my brain gave me a helping hand and filled in a gap for me, and that's when it clicked. The mystery man. It had been hard to decipher before due to the man's glasses, but when he nodded at Miles just before they took off, I realized where I had recognized him from. He was the VC worker the day the Ellens had checked in. I turned to Phil, my eyes wide, my cheeks flushed, a look of horror and anger on my face. James, what is it? Phil tried to get me to speak as I stormed over to the van, searching through the bags which contained the shredded and blood-stained belongings of the Ellen family. Hey, you can't do that, one of the HC reps yelled out. He began climbing into the back of the van, attempting to halt my behavior. I whipped out my revolver and aimed it at the man's head. Get back, I snapped. He held his hands up in the air. Phil, Richard, and the other HC rep began rallying around, gesturing me to calm down. The rep inside the van decided he didn't get paid enough to take a bullet to the head, so he backed off and climbed out of the vehicle and joined the rest. I rummaged through the piles of plastic until I found what I was looking for. That man in the VC did something with the Ellen's luggage. I pulled out 2 bags which contained the backpacks of the 2 Ellen children. I pulled out a knife and cut both bags open. I pulled out the packs and began searching the bag belonging to Dana Ellen. Her pack was pink with a floral pattern. I reached inside. Usual kid stuff. Toothbrushes, toys, crayons, a coloring book, and other essentials. But something felt out of place. I pulled it out. It was a sheet of paper, and on it were the words, "Beware the man in the woods. He watches you from the trees. He comes for you in your dreams. He's a man who inflicts pain and terror. Every child should fear Edward Dean Keller." It had been written in a black felt tip. Next, I pulled out the boy Jesse's backpack. This was a royal blue color, befitting of an 8-year-old boy. I fumbled around inside once again. This time, there was no paper with a strange poem about Keller. But just as I was pulling up my hand, something scratched at the back of it. I investigated further, shining my flashlight inside, and that's when I found what confirmed my suspicions. There, attached to the inside seam of the backpack, was a computer chip. Not even the group crowded outside the HC van could hold me back as I stormed off into the woods. It took me less than a few minutes to catch up to Miles, and it wasn't very hard. I just followed the sound of shovels driving into the dirt. I made my way through the forest until the sound of Miles' voice became quite obvious. A few more meters and I could see him and his friend both digging a hole in the side of a small hill. I began to march over to them, slowly unbuckling the holster on my utility belt. Phil and Richard were around 50 yards behind me at this point, yelling for me to stop, but I wasn't listening. In fact, the only thing that I could hear was a ringing tone in my ears. My eyes fixated on Miles. I guess this is what focused rage felt like. Miles turned to see me. "James, what are you—" His sentence was cut short by my fist drilling into his jaw. He stumbled back, and I wanted to hit him again, but he was a highly trained mercenary. He twisted my arm behind my back and pinned me to the ground face down. "You don't want to do this, kid, trust me," he warned. Hey, let him go, come on." Phil pleaded, and he and Richard came jogging through the trees. As Miles was facing them, I slid my knife out of my pocket and slashed at his calf. He yelped in pain as I jumped to my feet and pulled out my revolver, aiming the gun at Miles and pointing the knife at the other agency worker. "You're making a big mistake here, kid," Miles cautioned. "No, the only mistake that I made was thinking that you were a good person. I've just found the tracker on the boy's bag, and the little sick poem in the girl's bag. Tell me what you did, or I'll take your freaking head off," I snapped. "I just followed my orders," Miles said, shifting the blame. "Oh, BS, you lied to us. You said you were going to help them. Instead, you made sure the kids would find that note. You wanted to give Keller a way in, and then you would put a tracker on their bag, hoping that it would show us to his freaking lair. Freaking admit it," I demanded. Miles glared at me. "We put them in the kids' coats and shoes too," he admitted. It took everything in me not to pull that trigger right there. I started to cry. We had to make sure at least one was on their person when he came for them. I know you're angry, James, but you know the situation that we're in. We needed a result, and we weren't getting it. My boss demanded more drastic action," Miles explained. "Drastic action," I repeated, scoffing at the choice of words. "But it wasn't in vain, look." Miles walked over to the hole that he and the other man had dug. He tapped the tip of his shovel against the bottom of the hole. The sound of a metal door echoed from under the dirt. Miles turned to us and grinned. "Come on, James, if we didn't do something, they were dead anyway, along with everyone else." Miles tried to reason with me, gesturing for me to lower the gun. I began to relax. Miles turned to his friend and instructed him to get it open. The rest of the dirt was cleared off, revealing what I would describe as a hatch, similar to the basement doors that you would find on the side of a farmhouse, except this one was steel. A thick metal chain was wrapped around the handles, with an old, rusted padlock holding everything in place. Miles instructed the other agency worker, who had introduced himself as Nick after the guns and knives were lowered, to cut the lock. Nick also pleaded that he was just following his orders. I started to realize that's what all those phone calls were about. In fairness, they did seem to stress Miles out. Richard had also given me an insight to how ruthless the higher levels of the agency could be. I didn't like it and I didn't agree with it, but for now I accepted it. The lock snapped and the padlock fell into the dirt. Nick tugged at the metal until the chain was completely off. Miles and Nick grabbed a handle each and pulled with all their might. The bottom of the doors dragged the dirt with them as the two men struggled to get the hatch open, but eventually they did. We all drew weapons and flashlights and began to descend the steps into the dark room. When we had reached the bottom, we found that we were in some sort of cave. What we found was truly disturbing. A bed was in the corner, shackles attached to each bedpost. Blood and other stains in the mattress were there, especially the bottom half. Nearby stood a table, candlelit, brandishing a mixture of harrowing instruments. Phil gasped and began to hyperventilate as he pointed at the bed. We all turned to see what had gotten him so worked up, more than us. I've seen this place in a dream. He brought Billy here. He choked up before collecting himself. On the bed, he managed to add. He then pointed at a small opening in the corner of the room. You'll find what you're looking for in there. We all looked at each other and rushed to the hole. Miles and I climbed through and shone our flashlights. Our LED lights revealed 3 huge piles. Some of the bones there were dry, older looking, but some still had fresh meat on them. The rest were somewhere in between. Nick yelled for us to join him in the main chamber, and we rushed back to see what he had discovered. He stood in the space between the bed and the desk, and he waited until we were all watching before he bent down and retrieved something from the ground. A child's shoe, a small hiking boot, the foot still inside, with the fibula bone sticking out at the top. Nick ran his finger along the bottom of the sole before pulling the GPS chip off and crushing it in his fingers in disgust. Rather than talk about the vile discovery, we all just tried to ignore its existence and continued to search the rest of the cave, splitting off in separate directions. It was at this point that we made another discovery that quite frankly raised more questions than answers. Almost in unison, each of us yelled for the others. Hey, I've got another cave here. Me too. Me 3. There's another here. Jesus, there's gotta be 10 or 12 tunnels here. We all shone lights down each tunnel to see just how far they went. They went far, that was for certain. It was here that the 20-year-old vet, Phil, began to piece it all together. Wolf Lake is shaped like a dome. It's completely plausible that this cave system could exist, but I've never known this to be here. No one has ever mentioned it, he said, looking over at Richard. Hey, don't look at me. This is news to me too, Richard said, shaking his head just before his phone began to ring. He picked up. Hello, Bob, is that you? Hello, hey, listen, hold on, I'm underground, I can't hear you right now. Richard retreated up the stairs from which he had entered. It was here that Phil continued with his analysis of the situation. This tunnel here goes in the direction of the Wendy Cartwright sighting, he said, pointing down the dark pathway, checking his compass. He walked to the next tunnel. This one heads in the direction of the Robertson family site, he said, once again using the compass for reference. The Jensens, the Madisons, the Hamiltons, the Winstons. This is how he got them. This is where he took the kids. He brought them down into this cave. He was doing all kinds of wicked and evil things to them, right under our feet as we bagged up what was left of their parents. Phil's hands fell to his hips. He was struggling with the images in his head. He started to shake his head in defiance. But we dug, didn't we? The dogs led us to the sites. All we found were underwear. Why didn't we find the entrances? It's like this cave hadn't existed until today, Phil declared. We were all silent until a voice broke it. Richard's. Well, that's because it didn't, he said, a blank look on his face. He was white, drip white. What are you talking about? Miles inquired. Richard held up his cell phone. That was Bob Farrar. He's been trying to track down Alex Jessup and the black-robed people. We all leaned forward in anticipation for what had disturbed him so much. You all need to come with me right now, Richard said, waving us up the steps. Suddenly, Miles and Nick's phones began to buzz. They looked at each other extremely worried. Why? What's going on, Richard? I demanded to know. Richard took a deep breath. It's happening. Now.